Okay, so it's a great pleasure to have you here and to have a chance to talk to you about your life and your work.
Thank you.
You're a professor of history, well known in social and cultural anthropology, mostly for the contribution to the new orientation of the discipline to the self-critical period in the 80s and 90s, and your critiques of written ethnography. But would you start by telling us where you grew up? What was your childhood like?
I grew up in the northeastern part of the United States. Spent my childhood and teenage years in New York City and in Vermont, which is in New England, where my family had a summer house. And so I am a New Yorker. I still feel like a New Yorker, even though I've lived in California now for 35 years. And I will not be returning to New York, the diasporic homeland. I haven't cut the umbilical cord. I still feel attached to New York. It's still in some sense the center of my world. But I guess during the course of my life, as I think about it retrospectively, it's been an experience of decentering, not just personally going to California and leaving the Atlantic world, which I thought was the center, just as the Mediterranean had once been the center of the world for certain populations. We might even call them the West, what we used to call the West. It was first, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic-centered world. And I grew up in the Atlantic-centered world, and I consider myself a late Western subject. That's what I've become. I didn't start out a late Western subject. I started out a kid growing up in New York City and feeling like that this was it. New York, New York. It's a hell of a town. I had a pass for the subway. I could go downtown to Greenwich Village, and that was the happening place, the avant-garde place. And that was enormous. That was a great influence on me. What was the avant-garde? It was folk music, which was left-wing in those, folk music. Pete Seeger, I don't know if these names mean anything here. He was a former communist singer who was really a charismatic folk singer. But also the so-called theater of the absurd, Ionesco, Albee, Brecht. That's not the theater of the absurd, but that was the kind of things I was seeing in Greenwich Village, and which made a big influence on me as a teenager. So my family traveled a lot to England. My father was an English professor, and he took every opportunity he could to go to England. So I went to school in England, and then I eventually went to university for a year at the London School of Economics. And so that was my world, an Atlantic-centered world. And I then went to graduate school. I had a brief moment at Stanford after I graduated in history, but then I went to Harvard and finished my degree at Harvard. So up until about 1977, when I got my degree, that was the world for me. I had become a Francophile. My little act of rebellion against my father, who was an Anglophile, was for me to become a Francophile. Not a very big displacement, but it felt like something. And I spent a number of years in Paris, and that, of course, influenced my work.
And how were your university years? How could you compare London School of Economics and Harvard, for example?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I was an undergraduate at a small college, Haverford College, which is a Quaker college, identified with Quakers who were, anti-war, pacifist. And this was the period of the Vietnam War and the resistance to the Vietnam War. And our college was a big center of activism. And but that was my undergraduate years. Haverford is near Philadelphia. It's a very small college. From there, I went to Stanford for a year, and then left and came eventually to Harvard after a period of work as a draft resistor and a there was an anti-military movement going on, which founded things that we called GI coffee houses, which were outside military bases, and they were places for military guys in the military who wanted to resist or become conscientious objectors. We would give them support. We'd find them legal assistance, and propagandize them. And so I was actually part of a group that founded a place in Providence, Rhode Island, which is just south of Boston, which is a big Navy base. And our bookstore was called the Potemkin Bookstore, naval rebellion, right? The Potemkin. And so we had an image of the Potemkin battleship, the Panzerkreuzer Potemkin out of Eisenstein, above our store. I actually think at least 50% of our clientele were military intelligence people, but those were the conditions under which one worked. And I did that for a while, but I eventually got back to grad school at Harvard and got my degree. But then a couple of things conspired to open up for me the whole area of the Pacific, which was not at all part of my world or my upbringing. And I can tell you those stories that, about how you get, displaced like that. The first, one was that I ended up writing a doctoral dissertation on a French missionary anthropologist who worked in New Caledonia. I had no idea where New Caledonia was, but working on him and working on the details of and the intricacies of cultural translation, in this case in the process of translating the New Testament and doing field work over a course of 25 years, not just 1 or 2 years, but 25 years in a nasty colonial situation where he took the native side, and that sort of opened up the world of Melanesia to me, which I still consider to be the most interesting place in the world, just to be kind of chauvinistic about it. It was finding that thesis which actually found me, for reasons I could tell you, but it's kind of complicated. You go to study X and you come back studying Y. This is a common experience, certainly is in field work, and it is even if you're a historian going to study as I was going in Paris. So that opened the Pacific for me intellectually, and then I was lucky enough to get a job in this program where I've spent my entire academic career, the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And so that moved me to California. And then a lot of other possibilities and ways of thinking opened up for me then.
In the interview collection book on the Engines of Anthropology, you said you became interested in anthropology because of your girlfriend. Could you tell us about this? And how did you study anthropological subjects? How did you connect the previous historical studies with anthropology? And what were the most influential figures for you?
Well, I was studying history at Harvard, but I was studying intellectual history, we call it. I don't know what the German or Geistesgeschichte or something. No, the history of ideas, and social history. I was formed in social history and intellectual history at Harvard, and I didn't really. Anthropology was something that I sort of knew about. I said I did have this girlfriend, and who was who I think her name is Andrea Cousins. She was a big influence on me because Andrea was. This was part of that questioning of anthropology was underway, and Andrea was ahead of the curve. She was leading it, and she was very disaffected with anthropology. She thought it was colonialist. She thought it was epistemologically naive, and she was very smart, and she saw through it all. And so it was part of. I was with her during the period when she was leaving anthropology, right? So I watched her leave anthropology, but she left it in a very articulate way. So I think in retrospect, I learned a lot of critique and critical method directed to anthropology from her. But I didn't really expect to intervene in anthropology the way the work has finally done. I was going to be an intellectual historian, and there my big influence, as I think I might have said in those interviews, was Raymond Williams, British Marxist cultural and literary scholar, who wrote a book, Culture and Society. And I thought, well, which was a terrific book about, where I could see ideas embedded in their historical and social and cultural context. In his case, the idea of culture, but in the 19th century experience of industrialization, popular mass democracy, and social tension. And those were the 19th century context in which the ideas were embedded. So these were not ideas floating above social and cultural and embodied reality. They were right in it. So I liked his book, and I said, well, if he could do that for the humanist culture idea, he didn't talk about anthropology, maybe I can do it for the anthropological culture idea. And his context was industrialism and democratic change, and in Europe, and my context was empire, you know, and whatever post-empire might be, so has been and might still be. Intellectually, that's kind of how I got there. But you know as well as I do that you don't finding a thesis is there's a lot of just luck, and it's aleatory. It's not a thing where you say, oh, I will go there and do that. It's much more of a zigzag.
You found Lenhardt's works on a bookshelf in the library.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
That was just a chance. I came across it on a shelf when I was looking for another book. I came back with this book, and I had never heard of the man. And because I had heard of him, and because I impressed someone influential with that knowledge a few days later, which I would never have done if I hadn't stumbled on the book, he put me in touch with his family, and eventually I got all these documents and letters, and eventually I had to just do it. But it was a great thing because I went to France, but I leaped right back over the whole continent out to New Caledonia in Melanesia, and that was something I never expected to do, and which has been fantastic. I mean, I'm so grateful for that little bit of unscripted chance, a chance operation in my life. So there was no intentionality, and there's no intentionality too about moving from the New York and the Atlantic center of the world out to the Pacific, and finally realizing that it too was the center of the world, maybe even bigger, and there wasn't any intentionality. But in the process, I think, in my own merely personal experience, and it's just merely personal, there's nothing really exemplary about it, but I do think that it was part of a general shift that was going on in my part of the West, of decentering, of realizing that that world history was not a story of a group of cultures called the West gathered around the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, you know, who were lucky enough or unlucky enough to invent industrialization, who then disseminated their history and their culture to the rest of the world. That of course happened, and much of it under the flag of empire, but a lot of other things were happening in these places, and there were other histories or historicities cross-cutting it, which we now, I think, can see, and which were not so visible when the West could still consider itself the center. So my movement from New York was such an obvious center, you know, Wall Street, you know, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you know, avant-garde Greenwich Village. It was all there, the art world. Now, we all know there are many other centers, and some of them are in Shanghai, some of them are in, you know, Sao Paulo, and it's just a different map. My own movement in some way reflected the coming into view of that map. At least it did for me. So there's just a way that my personal displacement mapped onto a more general historical displacement, which I call the displacing or decentering of the West, which I think is the big event of the late 20th century. I'll be very crude about it. I think that's what happened in the last 50 years of the 20th century, was the decentering of the West.
Could you tell us more about the co-edition of writing culture with George Marcus?
Oh.
How did you meet George Marcus, and how
Yeah.
came the idea to edit such a book?
Okay, I will get to writing culture, but I just want to qualify what I said a moment ago about decentering the West. Decentering does not mean abolishing or transcending in Hegelian ways the West. The West, those powerful areas are still very much there. But it's just that there are other powerful areas and other histories that, the whole history of Asia as a world system with deep, social, economic, geographic roots, as an alternate world system, coming now into an articulated relation with the Western-centered world system. And then other histories coming from places, a lot of places, some of them the so-called indigenous places that I'm currently interested in. All of that was invisible, I think, to people like me in the 1960s and 70s, and it has become visible, and that's what happened to me. And I exhibit myself as as this late Western subject. Now, other people, I think, during these same years experienced displacement. People in Europe, people in formerly central locations. But they take different forms. But this is my story. Okay, now you want to hear about writing culture. Why?
Because you're mostly famous for it in social and cultural anthropology, I think.
But that's 25 years ago.
So
this makes me depressed. Everyone always wants. It's like I only did one thing in my life: writing culture.
It is considered as an important moment in social and cultural anthropology. I even had a professor who called the publication date of writing culture a symbolic date of postmodernism in anthropology.
I see. Yeah. You see, that's it. There's a simple story about it that has become now the canonical story, which I find irritating, although now I have to accept it because that's what people has come to think. Postmodernism, for example. Only 3 people in that book talk about postmodernism or in some way accept the label postmodernism. The 3 people from Rice, Marcus, Fisher, and Tyler, because at that time they were embracing postmodernism. That was a time when people could still say they were postmodernist and it was cool. Now it's usually a term of abuse. But I never used the term or thought of myself as a postmodernist. But once you have that word on your forehead, you can never take it off. And when my book, The Predicament of Culture, was translated into French, the Le Monde had a review of the book, and the little headline thing described me as the apostle of postmodernism, l'apôtre du postmoderne. I couldn't stop. But okay, postmodernism came into anthropology. Something happened then. There's no question. And writing culture came to symbolize it for many people. But in fact, writing culture is just part of a much bigger process, and it has come to symbolize this. For some people that's a good thing. There's still people in anthropology who think this is where we went wrong. This is the wrong turn, the bad venda. This is what we shouldn't have done. We got to get back to when we were still really rigorous anthropologists, and all this flaky postmodernism wasn't there. So there's a lot of people, and there's still people writing critiques of writing culture 25 years later. They're trying to drive a stake through the heart, of writing culture, trying to finally kill it. But it was just part of a moment. And, in my world, feminism, there was a lot of polemic about because we didn't do justice to feminism in writing culture, but that was because feminism was happening around it. That was part of it. It was an influence on writing culture. We should have engaged with it more, perhaps. But the whole sort of decolonizing moves within the academy, leading to postmodern, post-colonial theory, that kind of thing. All of that was going on. Said's book, had Orientalism had just come out. And so there was lots of critique, lots of questioning. Writing culture crystallized it. Why it did, I'm still a little bit of a mysterious to me of why it influenced people in other fields, which it did, in a lot of other fields. We thought a tempest in that phrase, a tempest in a teapot? That's an English phrase for an intense little fight, but in a very narrow place. A tempest in a teapot. You get the idea. In anthropology. A succès de scandale, a scandalous success in anthropology. Well, it could have been just that, but there was something about the way we framed it, and also something about the way that the anthropology's predicament, its problems, the things that it was wrestling with, and that resonated with people in film, people in literary studies, people in cultural studies of all sorts. There's a way in which looking at anthropology's problems, it gave them a slight distance on their own problems. Anthropology became an allegory for what they were going through. And I always thought, with respect to colonization especially, anthropology was very exposed because its method, fieldwork, was right in the middle of colonial and decolonial situations. So it had to deal with the pushing back and with the decentering and the critiques from below. Anthropology had to deal with that in a very public way. And no other discipline, they all had that problem, If you're a literary person in an all-white English department, all-male, all-white English department, you have that problem, But it didn't, they weren't exposed in the way anthropology was. And I think anthropology went through its crisis and has gone for the most part, in an exemplary way. I think it's a different field now. It is not the field it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
So what's the personal story behind this?
Do you want the gossip? You want the gossip. There's nothing dramatic,
How did it influenced you
with me.
Such a discussion around this book?
Well, look, I guess I was a sort of ambitious young guy and George and I knew, we thought we were onto something, I think. We knew that this was, the approach that we were doing in this book was hot, we thought. And so when we finished the seminar, which was this restricted seminar at the School of American Research in Santa Fe, they had a publication series with the University of New Mexico Press, which is a kind of a sleepy little series. It wasn't really, it didn't have much distribution. And we thought, no, we got to take this to a better press. So we took it to the University of California Press. Over their protest, they weren't happy that we did that. In fact, they took away all the money from us after. We didn't earn a penny from this book. People have written things accusing us of being in it for the money, but we never saw anything. But we got fame and glory instead, I guess, or notoriety. So you know what notoriety in English is? It's fame, but it's negative fame. And so we took it to the University of California Press, and they did a good job, and it distributed it, and it became a sort of figure, or we'll wait till this passes.
It's okay.
Okay, watch out. Here's writing culture. The alarm bells. So it did, but exactly why, to be honest, I don't know. And why did we do it? Well, it's because George had this idea, and we were both interested in literary and rhetorical approaches to ethnography, and we just came together. Nothing dramatic. And then we asked our friends.
And what would you say changed in those 25 years?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay.
It was an important period, and how would you describe the
Yeah.
changes that emerged
Yeah.
till now, to 2012?
Well, I've tried in this book that I've just finished called Returns, which is a kind of the third in a series, with Predicament of Culture the first and Roots the second, and this one Returns the third, each one representing a decade. You know, a decade, 10 years worth of essays and thinking kind of stitched together in a book. And so, since it is the third in that series, I'm thinking it that way, it has invited me to think historically about those 25 or 30 years, you know, what happened. In some ways, I'm working with all the same issues about culture and cultural identity and colonization and so forth. In this last book, more focused on contemporary indigenous societies. But as we were saying coming over here, an essay in Predicament of Culture about the Mashpee, identity in Mashpee, was all about these same issues. So in some ways, yes, the same questions throughout all these books, with problems of representation always present in the mix, but different. What's the difference? Well, different tools, different times, different pressures. You know, the books are determined by their context and their moment. So, writing culture, I see as a kind of perched between the 60s and the 90s. Now, the 60s, we have an idea of the 60s. That was a time of rebellion, question everything, overturn everything. So when I talked about my girlfriend Andrea and her throwing everything into doubt and saying goodbye to all that, she was a 60s. That was a 60s gesture that she was making. Now the 90s are a different story. By the 90s, neoliberalism is in place. The rhetoric of the 60s was about revolution, overturning everything. That seemed naive. You know, by the time we were doing writing culture, that was sounding naive. The hegemony of neoliberalism was coming into place. What it meant, and we started to talk about globalization and things like that. Now, in writing culture, there's no entry for globalization. There's no entry for the internet. There's no entry for post-colonial. It's another world, in a sense. I mean, all those things came in. They were coming in, but we didn't have words for them. Soon we did. And when you get to the 90s, we're in a kind of Gramscian war of position with respect to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is now a newly flexible world capitalist system, you know, post-Fordist system described by people like Jameson and Harvey. That world is in place. Thatcher and Reagan, this is the work of the 80s. Now, so writing culture is at the beginning of that period and at the end of the 60s. And there's something about its radicalism that is the 60s radicalism, you know, its willingness to throw a lot of things in question. But there's also something about its sense of rhetoric and the embeddedness of everything, and the disinclination to take some sort of position outside of history, or sort of an overview that, you know, to project a future. We always said we're interested in experimentation. We didn't have any model for the future. It was always experimental. It was always a sense that things are going to be done ad hoc, work them out, that you can't prescribe. You can't say, this is how it should be. This is the sovereign method, you know. This is the way, this is the key that will fix whatever your problems are. You'll always be using several methods. Your tools will always be compromised. You know, you'll never get out of rhetoric. You'll never get out of positionality or location. Well, writing culture had that. Now that's a 80s, 90s view of people who realize there is no outside to the system that they're working in, but the modes of resistance take place from within. Subversion and displacement and supplementarity, not revolution, you know. So you see where this writing culture is published in what, 86 or something, or 88, but the thinking is early 80s. You know, books, the date of a book's publication is not the date of its thinking. The date of its thinking is 5 years earlier, probably, because it takes several years to make a book and blah, blah. So that's it, and I see it that way, and it seems distant to me, really, as a approach. I mean, there's still people who read it and claim to find it useful, and I'm interested by that. But the current conjuncture, the current moment, is a very different one. And how to describe that, that's a big problem, you know. But historicizing the present is almost, you know, that's impossible. Well, you can do it, we have to do it, but the one thing you know is you're going to be wrong. History, you know, because history keeps on moving, and whatever you say, it will look silly within 20 years or 10 years, maybe sooner.
Could you say us a little bit about your current work and about your plans? You said you are...
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm finishing this book, which is called Returns, and it's in some ways the dialectical flip counterpart of Roots. Roots was all about displacement and diaspora, and this is more about homecoming, because that's what indigenous movements are about. But of course, they're impossible homecomings. They're homecomings, they're forms of ways of being local or indigenous which have diaspora and the internet, you know, and everything all through them. So you know, these are completely modern forms. So I'm writing about that, and I won't describe the book, but it's another kind of series of essays. Actually, it's three books, three like novellas, short book, 320 or 130 page chapters or stitched together. I always do want to push the form a little bit in my writing, and so this is what I've done here. And they're written in different styles, with different rhetorics, like I did in Roots to a great degree, and now I'm still doing that. So that book is going to be done, and my little trilogy will be finished, and I will never ever write another book like that again. Those three, that was enough. And what I do now, I'm not sure. Actually, I have a book on Conrad, Joseph Conrad, on the back burner, as we say. Maybe I'll write that. I don't know Polish, though, so that limits me. On the other hand, a lot of people have written about Conrad who don't know Polish, so why not me? That's an obsession, and so maybe. And then I'd really like to do something a bit different, but I don't know what it's going to be. But I know it will be online, because I think writing books is, it's not that it's finished, but it's increasingly a niche, and that there are other forms and ways to communicate that are a lot more effective.
So we will follow your internet website. And we're looking forward to see your lecture tomorrow, which will also be recorded. So thank you very much for your interview.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. It's always interesting to say things like this that you've thought and said before, of course, but in Poznań, they must mean something different. But that's up to you and your editing to figure out what that difference is.
Thank you very much.